Okay, so let's start with this quote. It's pretty striking. Am I a commie? Yes, but not the kind anyone warned you about.
Wow, yeah. That definitely grabs your attention.
It really does. You hear that word commie, and your mind jumps to certain places, right? Certain images, maybe warnings you've heard.
Absolutely. It's a loaded term.
Exactly. But today, we're going to dig into this really fascinating piece that, well, it takes that term and kind of flips it. It finds it in a very personal, almost moral way.
Right.
So our mission here is to unpack what this author is really getting at with that statement. And interestingly, how Kurt Vonnegut, the novelist,
Satirist, yeah.
and Eugene Debs, the early American socialist, how they fit into this as sort of moral guides for the author.
And what's really interesting right off the bat is how the author says what their kind of commie isn't.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, they're quick to say, it's not about ideological purity or strict party loyalty or even getting rid of excellence. They're not into turning sacred things into, like, slogans.
Yeah.
They specifically mentioned avoiding orthodoxy, gatekeeping, or their phrase was revolutionary cosplay.
Huh. Revolutionary cosplay. Okay, so if it's none of that, what's left? What is it about?
It seems to boil down to something, well, pretty fundamental, that the world should not be built on cruelty. That's the core principle.
That's a powerful pivot, isn't it, from this often rigid political label to something so human-centered.
Exactly. It's a very different framing.
So what are the kind of foundational ideas here? What beliefs shape this specific definition for the author?
Well, they lay out a pretty clear moral baseline. First, dignity is a human right, period. It's not some market variable based on what you produce.
Okay. Inherent dignity. Makes sense.
Right. And following from that, nobody should be discarded just because they lack measurable production. Your worth isn't your economic output. They also say suffering should never be made efficient. And crucially, nobody should ever be punished just for being poor.
These feel like very foundational, almost ethical points rather than purely political ones.
You really do. It's the bedrock, as they see it.
And this is where Kurt Vonnegut fits in, right? The author sees him as more than just a writer.
Definitely. They talk about him as someone who told the truth about systems that crush people and the people who look away.
Yeah. I mean, you think about Slaughterhouse-Five or his other work. He had this incredible ability to expose the absurdity and the cruelty, but with this deep humanity underneath.
Absolutely. His experiences, like being a POW in Dresden during the firebombing, you can feel how that shaped his view on how easily systems and societies can justify or ignore immense suffering.
He definitely saw through the fraud of patriotism, as the author puts it, or the hypocrisy sometimes found in polite society.
Right. He was searching for that moral baseline beneath the absurdity, which connects directly back to the author's core idea about avoiding cruelty.
So Vonnegut provides this sort of ethical anchor, this truth-teller vibe, but then there's Eugene Debs. The author mentions Vonnegut held Debs in reverence. Not just respect, but reverence, like a compass.
Yeah, that's a strong word, compass. So for listeners who might not know Debs as well, who was he? Why was he so important to Vonnegut and to this author?
That's a great question, because Debs is he's really central here. Eugene Debs was a major figure in the early 20th century, a labor organizer, co-founder of the IWW.
Wobbly's right.
Exactly. And he ran for president 5 times as the Socialist Party candidate. Famously, he got nearly 1 million votes in 1920 while he was actually in prison.
In prison? Why was he jailed?
For speaking out against U.S. involvement in World War I. He gave a speech opposing the draft, basically arguing it was a rich man's war fought by the poor, and was convicted under the Sedition Act.
Wow. Okay. So he clearly wasn't afraid to challenge power.
Not at all. And his significance here, I think, is his relentless focus on the working class, on very practical material needs, decent wages, housing, healthcare. He saw progress in terms of how society treated its most vulnerable.
So it wasn't just abstract theory for him. It was about the day-to-day realities.
Precisely, which aligns perfectly with this author's idea of a communism that's about tangible well-being, not just, political games or slogans.
That makes sense. Debs's focus on grounded material struggle, fighting exploitation, and like you said, his willingness to speak truth to power even when it cost him his freedom. You can see why that would resonate with Vonnegut's own anti-war, anti-establishment views.
Absolutely. And Vonnegut admired that courage, that consistency.
So it's this blend, Debs's focus on material justice and Vonnegut's critique of the systems and attitudes that ignore suffering.
Exactly. And that really brings us to the core question we're exploring in this deep dive. how do these different threads, this charged label, this beloved kind of darkly funny novelist who saw horrific things, and this early American socialist jailed for his beliefs, how do they weave together into something principled and coherent, especially now in our current political climate? That's what we want to unpack for you. So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, it's really clear that the author's definition of communism, it's not what you might initially think. It's not about state control or some far-off utopia.
No, not at all. It's incredibly grounded in, well, material reality, basic needs.
Right. Their kind of communism, as they put it, boils down to this: feed the worker, house the family, care for the sick, end the war, hold the liar accountable.
Simple, direct actions.
Yeah. And don't let cruelty become polite.
Yeah.
And don't mistake etiquette for ethics. It's really about less suffering, more grace.
And flowing from that is this really sharp critique of how modern politics and even social movements sometimes can operate.
How so?
Well, the author points out how vital concepts get watered down, like justice becoming just compliance rituals. Corporations checking boxes on social responsibility without real systemic change.
Right, I see that. Like equity becoming just an HR buzzword.
Exactly. Reduced to corporate HR strategy instead of tackling deep inequalities. And maybe most powerfully, how the language of liberation itself can get co-opted by institutions, sort of stripped of its radical meaning and used to actually maintain the status quo.
That's a sobering thought.
It is,
Yeah.
and it leads to the author's challenge. If movements aren't fundamentally talking about healthcare, housing, food, and labor, those core material needs,
Then what are they doing?
then the author argues they might just be managing perception and ultimately defending a class rather than truly fighting for the people.
And this is really where Vonnegut and Debs become such powerful anchors for the author's viewpoint, isn't it? It's not just that they shared some values.
No, it's like they offer two sides of the same coin. Debs was relentlessly focused on the structural changes needed to ease material suffering, feed the worker, house the family, like you said.
Practical on-the-ground fight.
Right. And Vonnegut, through his satire and his unflinching honesty, exposed the cultural lies, the hypocrisies, the ways we allow that suffering to happen or look away.
So one tackles the system, the other tackles the mindset that enables the system.
Precisely. Together, they create this lens for the author that looks at both the symptoms, the hunger, the poverty, the war, and the underlying societal sickness, the cruelty that's become acceptable. Their shared ground was human dignity, shared struggle, a critique of power structures, not getting lost in abstract debates or just identity politics detached from material reality.
It really comes back to that core idea the author states. This is not about politics. It's about moral alignment.
Exactly. They root it in lived experience, talking about seeing hunger up close and knowing who dies in every war. It's not theoretical for them.
It sounds deeply personal, like lighting candles not to be seen, but to keep going.
Yeah. It's about holding on to that conviction that even if the system is a lie, fundamentally, people still matter. It's a very empathetic and practical response to a harsh world.
It really is striking how this perspective cuts through a lot of the usual political noise to focus on these incredibly basic human needs and decencies.
It does simplify things in a way.
Which leaves you, the listener, with a pretty powerful question, I think. If the core of a philosophy really just boils down to less suffering and more grace and simply not making things worse, how does that change how you think about all those political labels we use? And what does it truly mean, then, to be on the side of the people?
Yeah, that's definitely something to mull over. It challenges you to look beyond the labels.